March 28, 1944. The cold air above the Ruhr Valley cuts thin at 23,000 feet. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt shudders as a burst of 20 mm cannon fire stitches across his right wing. Behind him, two Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek, deadly, painted in mottled gray, close the distance with mechanical precision. The German pilots have done this 100 times before. They expect what every Allied pilot does when cornered: panic, dive, pray. What they do not expect is what comes next. Johnson does something the Luftwaffe manual never anticipated. He drops his flaps. Not for landing. Not for slowing down. But at combat speed, high above the German industrial heartland, in the middle of a dogfight. The effect is immediate and absurd. His Thunderbolt, that 7-ton beast of American steel, lurches and pivots like a barn door caught in a gust. The sudden drag and lift rotation bring his nose around in a turn radius no P-47 should achieve. The lead FW-190, committed to its firing pass, screams past Johnson's canopy so close he can see the oil streaks on its cowling. For a heartbeat, Hunter and Hunted reverse rolls. Johnson's .50 caliber guns hammer into the German's tail section. Pieces of aluminum flutter into the slipstream. The Focke-Wulf rolls away trailing black smoke, its pilot no longer interested in the kill. This moment, this improvised, nearly suicidal maneuver, should not exist in the official playbook. It violated every aerodynamic principle taught at flight school. Dropping flaps at high speed risks ripping them clean off. It bleeds energy, makes you a sitting target, invites stall and spin. Yet here, in the crucible of combat over occupied Europe, it worked. And it worked not once, but again and again in the hands of pilots desperate enough to try it, skilled enough to survive it. The question that haunted Luftwaffe debriefings for months afterward was simple: how did American pilots, flying a fighter too heavy to dogfight, turn inside aircraft specifically designed to outturn them? The answer lay not in the machinery alone, but in what that machinery represented. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be graceful. Republic Aviation built it around a single philosophy: bring the pilot home. It carried 8.50 caliber machine guns, armor plate behind the seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a turbo-supercharged engine that could take punishment no Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf could absorb. It was not a duelist's blade. It was a sledgehammer wrapped in steel, forged in factories that produced one Thunderbolt every 63 minutes at peak production. German pilots called it der Jug, the Jug, for its bulbous fuselage. They respected its firepower. They did not fear its maneuverability. Until pilots like Johnson taught them otherwise. The Luftwaffe in 1944 flew under different pressures. Fuel shortages meant training hours had been slashed. New pilots arrived at frontline Jägerschwader units with barely 100 hours in type, sometimes less. They learned to fight by fighting, and the attrition was merciless. The veterans, the experten with Iron Crosses and 200 kills, still flew with lethal confidence. But even they operated within doctrines forged earlier in the war, when German fighters held qualitative superiority, when Spitfires and Hurricanes were the primary adversaries. The arrival of American heavy bombers and their escort fighters changed the mathematics of the air war. Suddenly, Luftwaffe pilots faced enemies who could absorb damage, maintain formation, and, most frustratingly, refuse to play by the established rules of aerial combat. Robert Johnson learned his craft not in the academies of Europe but in the sprawling training fields of Oklahoma and Florida. The American pilot production system, by 1944, was a continent-wide machine. Flight schools operated around the clock. Pilots accumulated 300 hours before seeing combat, sometimes more. They trained in aircraft that handled poorly on purpose, so operational fighters would feel responsive. They flew cross-country navigation until they could dead reckon through clouds. They practiced gunnery until deflection shooting became muscle memory. This was not artistry. It was industrial-scale competence, mass-produced like the bombers and fighters rolling off assembly lines in Wichita and Long Island and Burbank. And yet, within that system, improvisation thrived. Johnson's flap maneuver was never taught. It was discovered, tested, whispered between pilots in ready rooms and debriefing huts. Someone tried it, survived, and told others. The tactics spread not through official channels but through the oral tradition of men who lived and died by what worked. Some called it combat flaps. Others simply called it the silly trick. Flight instructors back home would have grounded anyone attempting it in training. In combat, it saved lives. The symbolism of the flap itself is worth considering. A flap is a device of transformation. It changes the wing's shape, its purpose, its capability. Extended, it grants lift at low speeds, allows heavy aircraft to land softly. Retracted, it permits speed, efficiency, the clean lines of predatory flight. But in Johnson's hands, in that frozen instant above the Ruhr, the flap became something else entirely, a tool of defiance, a rejection of prescribed limits. It said, in effect, that the machinery could be bent to the pilot's will, that doctrine was negotiable, that survival rewarded creativity over conformity. German pilots, encountering this for the first time, faced a cognitive dissonance. The Focke-Wulf 190 was, by any technical measure, superior in turning performance to the Thunderbolt. Its lighter wing loading and radial engine gave it advantages the Republic fighter could not match in a traditional turning fight. Luftwaffe tactics emphasized exploiting this superiority, forced the American into a horizontal scissors, tighten the turn, close to gun range kill. But when the American did the unexpected, when the heavy jugs suddenly rotated inside their turn, the calculus broke down. Training had not prepared them for an opponent willing to sacrifice every advantage of speed and energy for a single snapshot opportunity. The Americans, it seemed, fought with a recklessness born of abundance. They had more fuel, more ammunition, more aircraft, more pilots. They could afford to take risks the Luftwaffe could not. This was the deeper truth Johnson's maneuver exposed. The Thunderbolt's flaps, sturdy and over-engineered like everything else on the aircraft, could withstand the stresses because Republic aviation designed them to withstand punishment beyond normal operational limits. There was no elegant efficiency here, no lightness of structure. Instead, there was redundancy, strength, the assumption that pilots would push equipment to extremes and the equipment had to endure. German aircraft, built under resource constraints and doctrines emphasizing performance efficiency, could not replicate this philosophy. A Focke-Wulf pilot dropping flaps at combat speed risked structural failure. An American pilot did so knowing his aircraft was built to tolerate his mistakes. The air battles over Germany in the spring of 1944 turned on such margins. Every week, the 8th Air Force sent hundreds of bombers into Reich airspace, escorted by swarms of Thunderbolts, Mustangs and Lightnings. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, but the balance had shifted irrevocably. For every American fighter lost, 2 more appeared. For every German expert killed, his replacement had half the training and a quarter of the experience. The tactics that had once dominated, the high-speed slashing attacks, the precision gunnery, the coordinated swarm formations, became desperate, improvised, eroded by attrition and fuel shortages and the relentless pressure of an enemy that simply would not stop coming. Johnson himself would survive the war with 28 confirmed kills, his Thunderbolt so damaged on one mission that ground crews counted over 200 bullet and cannon holes in the airframe. He never ejected, never bailed out. The jug always brought him home. In post-war interviews, he spoke of the flap maneuver with a mixture of pride and bewilderment, as if still surprised it had worked at all. Other pilots adopted it, refined it, integrated it into their personal bag of tricks. It never became official doctrine. The Air Force never issued a technical bulletin endorsing combat flap deployment. But in the unwritten manual of survival tactics passed between fighter pilots, it earned a place. There is a photograph, grainy and fading, taken at an airbase in England in May of 1944. A group of P-47 pilots stands before their aircraft, young men in leather jackets and crusher caps, smiling with the easy confidence of those who have seen death and walked away. Behind them, a Thunderbolt's wing displays a line of small swastikas, kill markings, each one a German fighter that misjudged the jug's capabilities. The flaps on that wing are scarred and patched, testament to stresses they were never meant to endure in the elegant designs of peacetime aviation. But they held. They always held. The flap, then, becomes more than a mechanical component. It is a metaphor for adaptation, for the willingness to defy limitation, for the democratic ideal that rules exist to be questioned and, when necessary, broken. The Luftwaffe flew with precision and doctrine, with tradition stretching back to Richthofen and Bolk, with an aristocratic conception of aerial combat as individual skill refined through discipline. The Americans flew with pragmatism and abundance, with a willingness to throw mass and industrial power at problems, with a democratic assumption that any farm boy from Iowa or factory worker from Detroit could be taught to fly and fight and survive. Johnson's silly maneuver was the embodiment of that philosophy, ungraceful, improvised, effective. By war's end, the Thunderbolt had flown more combat missions than any other American fighter. It had destroyed more ground targets, absorbed more damage, and brought home more pilots than sleeker, more celebrated designs. Its kill-to-loss ratio improved steadily as pilots learned not to dogfight like Spitfires, but to fight like Thunderbolts, with energy, firepower, and the confidence that their aircraft would endure whatever punishment the enemy delivered. The flap maneuver was a small part of that evolution, a tactical footnote in the larger narrative of air superiority. But for the German pilots who encountered it, who watched in disbelief as the heavy American fighter outturned them in a contest it should have lost, it was a moment of revelation. The enemy they faced was not bound by the old rules. They brought new rules, built from different assumptions, forged in a nation that produced 50,000 combat aircraft in a single year and could afford to let pilots experiment with unconventional tactics because there would always be another aircraft, another pilot, another chance. The sun sets over the Ruhr Valley on that March evening in 1944, casting long shadows across the scarred industrial landscape below. Robert Johnson's Thunderbolt turns for home, fuel gauges dropping, ammunition expended, the frame trembling with the vibrations of an engine pushed beyond limits. Behind him, somewhere in the haze, a Focke-Wulf limps toward an emergency field, its pilot shaking his head, trying to explain to intelligence officers how the impossible happened. The war will continue for another year, brutal and grinding, consuming men and machines in quantities that numb comprehension. But in this moment, in the cold thin air above Germany, a small truth has been proven, that innovation belongs not only to engineers and generals, but to the desperate and the bold. That survival rewards those willing to make the aircraft dance in ways it was never designed to dance. That freedom, in the end, is measured not only in grand strategies and production statistics, but in the space a pilot has to drop his flaps at 300 miles per hour and live to tell the story. The flap, scarred, patched, holding against aerodynamic forces that should tear it free, remains the symbol. Not of elegance, but of endurance. Not of doctrine, but of defiance. A small movable surface on a metal wing, become the hinge upon which individual lives turned, and with them, the slow grinding pivot of history itself.